The gravel crunched beneath the tires, a harsh, solitary sound that seemed to amplify the silence around me. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, not from fear, but from the sheer, almost pathological need for control. Every tool in my meticulously organized kit, every carefully wrapped linen swatch and bottle of solvent, hummed with a similar, quiet tension in the back of the estate vehicle. My life was a series of precise measurements, of knowing exactly where every antique's hairline fracture lay, how much pressure a delicate veneer could take before splintering. But this was an unknown variable on a scale I'd never encountered. The solicitor's voice still echoed in my memory, dry and clipped, delivering the news of an inheritance I hadn't known existed. A distant relative, Mr. Reed. A manor house. Quite old. Quite isolated. Understatement, I now realized, was a talent the legal profession cultivated with grim dedication. The winding, overgrown track finally gave way, opening onto what could only be described as an accusation of a driveway. It was a vast, circular expanse choked with weeds, the skeletal remains of what might once have been an ornate fountain standing like a petrified sentinel in its center. Beyond it, the manor loomed. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hulking mass of darkened stone and crumbling mortar that seemed to actively absorb the pale afternoon light. Gable ends sagged like tired shoulders, and chimneys stood askew, their brickwork softened by centuries of rain and neglect. A faint, cloying scent, a mix of damp earth, decaying wood, and something metallic, like old pennies left in a puddle, began to seep through the closed windows of the vehicle. I cut the engine. Stepping out, my boots sank slightly into the mossy gravel. I walked towards the house, my gaze sweeping over its colossal facade, cataloging every broken pane, every cracked stone, every sagging gutter. It was a restorer's nightmare, a monumental undertaking that would swallow years, perhaps decades. Yet, beneath the daunting scale, a peculiar excitement began to stir. This wasn't just a house, it was a testament to time, a canvas of forgotten craftsmanship. The main entrance was a grand, double-doored affair, carved from oak that had long since turned black and fissured. A heavy iron knocker, shaped like a grotesque lion's head, was rusted solid. I pushed, testing the weight, and to my surprise, one of the doors groaned inward, releasing a breath of air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something stagnant and profoundly old, like the breath of a tomb. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing unnaturally on what felt like stone flags beneath a thick blanket of detritus. The light filtering in through the grimy windows was sickly green, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like phantom snowflakes. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from every archway and chandelier. Furniture, covered in white sheets that had yellowed and rotted over time, stood like ghostly sentinels, their forms hinting at forgotten elegance. My initial professional assessment gave way to a prickle of unease. This wasn't just neglect, it felt like abandonment, an abrupt departure. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet everything felt wrong. No sign of vandalism, just the slow, inevitable creep of decay. I moved deeper into the house, my hand trailing along a wall where peeling wallpaper revealed layers of forgotten patterns, faded florals, then a stark geometric design, then something that looked like rough, unpainted plaster. The temperature dropped further as I ventured past a cavernous drawing room, its grand piano a silent, dusty monument, and into a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the manor. At the end of this corridor, where the light from the main hall barely reached, I noticed something peculiar. The wall here was different. It felt out of place, a brutal insertion into what was otherwise an ornate, if decaying, structure. It absorbed the light, felt older, much older than the surrounding architecture. Then I saw it. Not a door, not a window, but a seamless, almost invisible seam in the granite, barely wider than my hand, running vertically from floor to ceiling. It wasn't a crack, it was a deliberate line, too straight, too precise to be natural. My meticulous nature, the part of me that sought out every hidden joint and secret compartment in antique furniture, flared with an almost irresistible urge to investigate. I pressed my ear to the cold stone. Nothing. No sound, no hint of a cavity beyond. I traced the seam with my fingertips, pushing gently, testing. There was no give. Not at first. But then, as I applied pressure to a specific point, a faint, almost imperceptible click resonated from within the wall. A section of the granite, perhaps 6 feet high and 4 wide, began to recede inward with a low, grinding groan, revealing not a room, but a narrow, unlit passage. The air that rushed out was dead, utterly devoid of freshness, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sharp and acrid, like fear congealed over centuries. My breath hitched. This was no typical Manor secret, no hidden pantry or priest hole. I pulled out my powerful penlight. The beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a short, descending flight of rough-hewn stone steps. At the bottom, a heavy, iron-bound door stood ajar, its surface pitted with rust. Each door bore a small, barred aperture, like a single, malevolent eye. My mind, so accustomed to the delicate intricacies of historical craftsmanship, struggled to reconcile this brutal, stark architecture with the decaying grandeur of the manor above. The air here was suffocating, heavy with a palpable sense of confinement and despair. This wasn't a cellar. It wasn't a dungeon in the romantic sense. The design, the sheer, unyielding functionality of it, was unmistakable. My professional curiosity had collided with something deeply, profoundly unsettling. The manor's heavy oak front door groaned shut behind me, a sound like a forgotten beast settling back into slumber. I stood in the cavernous entrance hall, the air thick with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood or decaying iron. My breath plumed faintly in the chill. I prided myself on my composure, on the meticulous order I brought to chaos, and this house was chaos personified. My first task, after unloading the mountain of equipment from the van, was to choose a starting point. I ignored the grand, peeling wallpaper of the hall, the sagging tapestries that clung to the walls like molting skin. Instead, I gravitated towards a smaller, less imposing room off to the left, a study, perhaps, or a library, judging by the skeletal remains of bookshelves lining one wall. It was still choked with shrouded furniture, but even through the canvas sheets, I could discern the promising silhouette of a large, sturdy desk in the center. I spent the next few hours in a methodical frenzy, a ballet of calculated movements. Dust sheets were peeled back, revealing dark, heavy wood, scarred by time and neglect. I set up my portable worklight, its harsh beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. I pulled on my linen apron, the familiar way to comfort. The desk was a beast of an antique, solid mahogany, its surface a mosaic of water rings, scratches, and a thick, grimy patina. I started with a gentle cleaning solution, working in small, precise circles, watching the grime lift away. After a solid hour, I reached for my smallest, sharpest scraper, intending to tackle a stubborn patch of dried varnish near the desk's edge. I had placed it, I was sure, on the felt mat to my immediate right, nestled between a pot of wood conditioner and a microfiber cloth. My hand went there, but met only the rough felt. I frowned. My gaze swept over the desk, then the floor around me. Nothing. A flicker of irritation, that I spotted it, on the far side of the desk, near the window. Resting atop a stack of forgotten ledgers. I stared at it. That was impossible. I hadn't even approached that side of the desk yet. I was a creature of habit, of order. I never moved a tool without conscious intent, and certainly not across an entire workspace. I walked around, picked it up, and returned it to its proper place, dismissing it as a momentary lapse, a trick of a tired mind. The house, after all, was vast and unsettlingly quiet. It was easy to get disoriented. I resumed my work, the incident nudging at the back of my thoughts. The scraping began again, a delicate, almost surgical process. Minutes later, a faint rustle sounded from somewhere above me, like dry leaves skittering across an attic floor. I paused, scraper held aloft. The sound didn't repeat. Just the house settling, I told myself, a gust of wind through a loose pane. Yet, there was no wind that I could feel, and the air within was utterly still. It wasn't just the house settling. I felt the prickle on the back of my neck, the subtle shift in the air pressure that suggested someone standing just behind my shoulder. I spun around, my heart giving a clumsy thump against my ribs. Empty. I found myself listening, not for sounds, but for an absence of them, for the precise moment when the house would betray itself. I picked up a larger, coarser sandpaper, ready to move on to the next stage of restoration, but my fingers brushed against something else in the tool tray. A small, tarnished silver locket. It wasn't mine. I didn't own anything like it, and it certainly wasn't a restoration tool. I picked it up, its cold metal surprisingly heavy in my palm. It was crudely fashioned, tarnished to near black, with no discernible engravings. Where had it come from? I had meticulously laid out my tools this morning. This was not among them. This was a thing, a physical object, appearing from nowhere. I pocketed the locket, a nervous energy buzzing beneath my skin. No door, no window, just a continuous expanse of plaster and faded wallpaper. But something about it was off. The pattern of the paper didn't quite align, a subtle discontinuity that only a meticulous eye would catch. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling a faint seam, a barely perceptible change in texture. Pushing aside a heavy, draped armchair, I found it, a hidden latch, cleverly disguised, almost flush with the wall. My fingers fumbled with it, the cold metal surprisingly stiff. The passage led to a short, descending staircase, roughly hewn, ending abruptly at a heavy, bolted door. This door, unlike the elegant oak of the manor, was thick, unadorned iron, marred by rust and what looked like deep, gouged scratches. My light played over the surface of the door, then down to the floor. And that's when I saw the engraving, crude but unmistakable, etched into the stone lintel above the iron portal, segregation unit isolation cells. My heart, which had only thumped before, now hammered with a desperate, frantic rhythm. My rational mind, my meticulous, ordered world, shattered. This wasn't just an old house. This was something else entirely. And I was standing at its threshold. The metallic tang in the air suddenly felt less like old iron and more like something ancient, something that had been waiting and watching. My initial assessment, a quick, sweeping glance, confirmed what my nose already knew: this place was a tomb, not a home. But it was my tomb now, and I had a job to do. That metallic sweetness, though unsettling, was just another layer of decay I intended to strip away. I pulled a dust sheet from my kit, unfurling its pristine white over a particularly ornate, but crumbling, side table near the grand staircase. The sharp crackle of the fabric seemed deafening in the echoing silence. The first few days were a blur of meticulous, backbreaking work. I started with the entrance hall, sweeping away centuries of dust, carefully cataloging what remained of the furniture, and examining the structural integrity of the walls and ceiling. My hands, usually so steady and precise, ached by evening, but it was a satisfying ache. Each layer of grime removed revealed a hint of forgotten grandeur, a whisper of the Manor's original design. I was a detective of lost beauty, and this was my grandest case yet. I'd been humming a familiar tune, something from a classical piece I often listened to in my workshop, but the melody suddenly felt distant. What was it? I tried to recall the composer, the title, even just the next few notes, but my mind was a blank. It was like trying to grasp smoke. I frowned, shaking my head slightly. Too much dust, too much quiet. Isolation was playing tricks. I probably just needed a proper meal. I moved on, dismissing the odd mental hiccup. The wall I was working on felt unusually thick in one section, even for the Manor's robust construction. My probing finger detected a slight unevenness, a subtle deviation in the plasterwork that my experienced eye wouldn't have caught without such close inspection. It was just above waist height, about where a picture rail might have been, long since removed. I tapped it gently with the handle of my trowel. This wasn't a repair. This was deliberate. My heart quickened, a different kind of excitement bubbling up, the thrill of discovery. I carefully chipped away more plaster, following the seam. It outlined a rectangular panel, roughly the height of a man and half as wide. There was no visible handle, no keyhole. Running my fingers along the edges, I felt a faint ridge, barely perceptible, that suggested a hidden mechanism. It took another hour of careful work, a delicate dance of scraping and probing, before I found it, a small, almost microscopic button, disguised as a decorative nailhead, just beneath the panel's lower right corner. I pressed it. It was the smell of forgotten despair, of sealed-off time. I shone my lamp inside. It sloped downwards, barely wide enough for my shoulders. After a short descent, the corridor opened into a larger, circular chamber, surprisingly spartan and unsettlingly bare. There were no windows, no light fixtures. They looked like something from a forgotten prison. This wasn't a pantry. This wasn't a wine cellar. My lamp beam fell upon a rusted plaque on the central door, barely legible through the corrosion. I wiped away the grime with my sleeve. Segregation. Isolation. Cells. Here? In this manner? My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the elegant decay of the main house with this brutal, functional space hidden beneath it. What kind of history had this place truly witnessed? I tried the handle of the central door. It was locked, of course, but the mechanism groaned as if it hadn't been touched in decades. On a small, dusty ledge near the entrance to this grim chamber, nestled amongst fallen mortar, I found it, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle, its pages swollen with damp. I pulled on a pair of thin gloves from my kit, carefully picking it up. Back in the relative warmth of the corridor, I flipped it open. The handwriting was cramped, precise, and dated from nearly a century ago. I skimmed through the first few entries, my breath catching in my throat. Subject 4, showing signs of advanced erosion. Memory retention severely compromised. Identity dissolution progressing as anticipated. The murmurs from the cells grow louder, though no physical source is discernible. Concern regarding the entity's increasing reach, the boundaries of the unit may be insufficient. A complete loss of self in Subject 7. The quiet ones are truly quiet now. Erosion. Identity dissolution. Entity. Quiet ones. It was vague, terrifyingly so, hinting at something monstrous without ever naming it. This wasn't local history, this was a personal, terrible chronicle. The air in the hidden passage felt heavy, suffocating. The scent of dust and damp stone, once familiar, now seemed alien. My own name, Reed, felt strange on my tongue when I silently repeated it. Was that truly my name? A flicker of doubt, brief but potent, passed through me. I shook my head, a sharp, deliberate motion. No. Of course it was my name. This place, this journal, it was getting to me. It had to be. I was tired, that was all. Just tired. It was as if a tiny, almost imperceptible crack had formed in the foundation of who I was. And the manor, in its ancient, silent way, seemed to be watching. The journal lay heavy in my lap, its leather cover cool against my trembling fingers. Erosion. Identity dissolution. Entity. Quiet ones. The words had burrowed into my mind, sharp splinters of a truth I was only just beginning to grasp. This wasn't some quaint historical anecdote, this was a warning, a personal horror story unfolding over generations. Fear, a cold, creeping fog, tried to settle in my chest, but beneath it, a stubborn knot of determination tightened. I had to understand. I spent the next few days lost in the manor's dusty archives, a treasure trove of forgotten lives. The library, a cavernous room I'd barely touched, became my sanctuary and my prison. Cobweb-draped shelves groaned under the weight of ledgers, letters, and brittle newspaper clippings. My fingers, stained with ancient dust, traced faded ink. I looked for anything out of place, anything hinting at the bizarre. The earliest records were mostly mundane: property transfers, birth announcements, harvest reports. But as I moved through the centuries, a pattern, faint at first, began to emerge. There were gaps, sudden silences in the family chronicles. A mention of a distant relative, a daughter named Ilara, who departed for the continent but with no further record of her arrival or life abroad. A son, a generation later, described as having a melancholy disposition before his name simply vanished from the ledgers, replaced by a terse note about unforeseen circumstances. Then came the more unsettling fragments. A local gazette from the late 1800s carried a small article about the peculiar case of the manor's owner, who was found wandering the village square, unable to recall his own name or address. He was described as utterly bewildered, his eyes holding a vacant, distant quality. He died a few weeks later, still nameless in his own mind. Another clipping, years later, detailed the disappearance of a housekeeper, vanishing without a trace despite the manor being locked from within. The police investigation yielded nothing. A local tragedy, the article concluded, attributed to the isolation of the estate. Isolation. This wasn't just a place, it was a hungry mouth, devouring those who came too close. The journal's cryptic entries about erosion and identity dissolution now felt less like abstract metaphors and more like grim, literal descriptions. The quiet ones, were they the forgotten, the erased? Then they grew bolder, more vivid. Then, the walls shimmered, wavered, and I was back in my own bed, the moonlight slicing through the window. The waking hours offered little reprieve. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the very fabric of the house. The memory gaps were the worst. I'd set a book down, intending to pick it up again in a moment, only to find it hours later on a different table, or even a different floor, with no recollection of moving it. I'd start a task, like cleaning a specific piece of furniture, and then find myself in a completely different part of the house, my tools abandoned, with no memory of how I got there or what I had been doing. My thoughts, once so precise and orderly, felt like scattered leaves in a rising wind. One afternoon, I was staring at my reflection in a tarnished silver tray I was polishing. But for a fleeting moment, my eyes seemed wrong. Not my eyes at all. They held a different light, a different history, a sorrow that wasn't mine. I blinked, and the image snapped back, my own familiar gaze returning, but the unsettling sensation lingered. Who was I becoming? Or, more terrifyingly, who was I unbecoming? The journal's words, erosion and identity dissolution, were no longer just things I read. They were things I felt, things that were happening to me, right now, in this house. And I was determined to fight it, even as the edges of my own self began to fray. The word quiet had been scrawled, half-finished, at the bottom of the page, as if the writer had been interrupted, or worse, had simply faded away mid-sentence. Isolation. That word resonated with a chilling echo. The quiet was its method, I suspected, a slow, suffocating process. I pushed the heavy leather journal across the dusty surface of the study desk, the sound of it slide unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. My fingers, stained with centuries of grime from the Manor's restoration, trembled slightly. It wasn't fatigue. The air in the study felt heavier than usual, thick with something I couldn't quite place, not just dust, but a kind of static charge, a precursor to a storm or a presence. I was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I was in the Manor, working. This was real. What if the erosion had already begun? How would I even know? A faint scratching sound started, not from the walls, but from inside my own skull, it seemed. A dry, insistent scrape, like fingernails dragging across rough stone. My scalp prickled. Then, the light shifted. Not the sun through the grimy windows, it was late afternoon, the light already fading, but an internal shift. The room seemed to expand and contract, breathing like some ancient, colossal lung. The familiar oak paneling rippled, its grain warping and twisting into grotesque faces that stared back at me with empty, ancient eyes. This wasn't just a trick of the light. This was an imposition. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my own breath misting in the air, even though there was no logical reason for it. They were in my ears, in my head, pressing against my eardrums. No, I muttered, shaking my head, trying to clear the auditory assault. This isn't real. A snippet of my grandfather's voice, then a colleague's, then my own, all uttering nonsensical, menacing phrases. The room dissolved. The air grew stale, metallic, smelling of disinfectant and despair. I was no longer in the manor. I was somewhere else. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the familiar calluses, the faint stains of varnish and wood dust. Instead, they looked alien, pale and trembling, the skin unnaturally smooth, devoid of any defining marks. Panic seized me. Who am I? The question ripped from my throat, raw and desperate, but the voice that answered was not my own. I was in a small, windowless cube. My mind screamed for purchase, for anything familiar. This was it, wasn't it? The erosion. The identity dissolution. This was what the journal warned of. I was trapped within my own mind, or rather, trapped within a construct imposed upon my mind. The walls around me were seamless, impenetrable. There was a narrow slit at the bottom of what I assumed was a door, but no handle, no way out. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, even though I knew, deep down, that I had never been in such a place. This was a lie. A manufactured reality. But it felt so utterly, horrifyingly real. It was real. Or my mind was making it real. My name. They presented me with flashes of memories, but they weren't mine. A child's birthday party I'd never attended, a heated argument with a woman I didn't know, a distinct scent of jasmine that meant nothing to me. They were fragments, alien pieces, being shoved into the spaces where my own memories should have been. I closed my eyes, fighting against the barrage, clutching at the few anchors I had left. The feel of the old wood in my workshop, the specific scent of linseed oil, the intricate carvings on a forgotten chest. My work. My craft. That was me. That was Reed. When I opened my eyes again, the harsh, gray cell was gone. I was back in the study, slumped against the desk, the journal still before me. My hands were still trembling, and when I looked at them, they looked normal. Familiar. But the memory of their alien smoothness, the lack of calluses, was burned into my mind. I pushed myself upright, my legs wobbly, my head throbbing. But it was my face. My own face, or was it? Was I really seeing myself, or was my mind simply reasserting a false image to soothe the shattered fragments of my identity? The lines between what was real and what had been imposed were no longer merely blurred, they were smudged, smeared, almost entirely erased. The entity wasn't just in the manor. It was inside me. And I had no idea how to get it out. The whispers were a physical weight, pressing in on my skull, vibrating behind my eyes. They had shown me faces I didn't recognize, lives I hadn't lived, and the sheer audacity of it, the violation, was enough to snap something inside me. Enough to cut through the haze of confusion and ignite a desperate, furious clarity. Now. I clutched at it, repeating it under my breath, trying to anchor myself. This wasn't a restoration project anymore, it was a prison. I bolted, a sudden, frantic energy surging through my limbs. The grand staircase, usually a testament to forgotten craftsmanship, seemed to stretch endlessly, each tread groaning beneath my weight. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light piercing the grimy windows, looking like malevolent, swirling galaxies. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was exhaling stagnant memories. My first thought was the front door. The massive oak slab, studded with tarnished iron, had always felt imposing, but now it radiated an almost sentient resistance. I reached for the brass handle, cold and slick under my palm, and twisted. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. I put my shoulder into it, straining, grunting, the old wood splintering faintly. I tried again, harder, my muscles burning, but the door remained sealed, an unyielding barrier. It wasn't just locked, it felt welded shut, an integral part of the wall. Panic began to coil in my gut. I stumbled back, my gaze sweeping the cavernous entry hall. Windows. There had to be windows. I lunged towards a tall, leaded pane, its glass opaque with years of neglect. I hammered at it with my fist, then with the heel of my palm. The glass, thick and ancient, didn't even crack. It just vibrated with a dull thrum, like striking stone. Okay. Not the front. Not the windows. The back door, then. Or the kitchen entrance. Any way out. I spun, disoriented for a moment, the layout of the house suddenly shifting in my mind. Had the library always been on the left? Was that a new archway to the right, leading into what used to be the dining room? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, trying to trust my own memory. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, each turn feeling less familiar than the last. I passed portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me, their smiles widening into unsettling grins. Did I remember that one? That stern-faced patriarch with the heavy jowls? Or was it another phantom memory, planted by the entity? My hand went to my pocket, searching for my phone. It had to be there. I always kept it on me. My fingers fumbled, brushing against lint, then nothing. Where was it? I remembered charging it, just yesterday. Or was it this morning? A week ago? The timeline was blurring. I retraced my steps, a frantic scavenger hunt. Kitchen? No. Workshop? The small study where I sometimes reviewed blueprints? There it was, lying on the dusty desk, a small, rectangular beacon of hope. I snatched it up, my fingers clumsy with urgency. Dead. Completely, utterly dead. I pressed the power button repeatedly, jabbing it with my thumb, willing it to life. I shook it, as if that would somehow coax electrons back into circulation. I hurled the phone across the room, watching it clatter against the far wall, then slide to the floor, inert. It was a stupid, futile gesture, but I felt a primal need to lash out, to strike back at the invisible force that was tightening its grip. Then I remembered the landline. There was an old rotary phone in the library, a relic I hadn't bothered to restore yet. It was buried under a pile of books and forgotten periodicals, its plastic yellowed with age. I found it, tugging at the coiled cord, knocking a stack of dusty tomes to the floor. The dial tone, when I finally lifted the receiver, was a glorious, albeit slightly distorted, hum. I started to dial the emergency services number, my fingers trembling. But as I punched in the first digit, a strange sensation overtook me. My mind went blank. Who was I calling? What was the number? The digits swam before my eyes, meaningless. I knew it, it was ingrained in my memory, but it was just gone. Their faces were there, fleetingly, but their names, their numbers, they were just out of reach, like words on the tip of my tongue, forever unsaid. My hand dropped, the receiver clattering against the ancient wood of the desk. This wasn't just the house blocking me, it was me blocking me. The entity wasn't just sealing the exits, it was sealing off my own mind. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about retaining myself. This was different, carrying with it a metallic tang, like stale blood in damp earth. Behind a row of particularly heavy, leather-bound volumes on obscure legal precedent, I noticed a hairline crack in the plaster. Curiosity, a habit ingrained from years of restoration work, momentarily eclipsed my despair. I pushed aside the books. The crack wasn't just a crack, it was the outline of a hidden door, cleverly disguised. My fingers traced the faint seam. I found a small, almost invisible latch and pressed it. With a soft click and a groan of ancient hinges, the section of shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. A gust of that same metallic, damp air swept over me. The passage descended steeply, a suffocating tunnel of rough-hewn stone. It reeked of confinement, of forgotten despair. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing walls scarred with what looked like desperate scratch marks, too high for a human hand, too precise for random decay. I hesitated, the fight or flight instinct warring with the insatiable need to understand. But there was nowhere else to go. No other exit. No other hope. This was either a way out, or a deeper trap. And deep down, I knew which it was. This was no cellar. This was no storage facility. This was something far more sinister. My flashlight beam lingered on one of the doors, then another, and another. I was in a place designed for utter, inescapable isolation. And I wasn't alone. I could feel it. They didn't need to speak. The silence was their loudest statement. Eration. A cold, hard defiance ignited, cutting through the swirling confusion like a knife. This thing, whatever it was, had been playing with me, twisting my reality, but no more. I would not be a puppet. One moment I was straining against the invisible weight, the next, the air around me solidified, growing heavy and stale. I blinked, and the rough-hewn stone walls of the hidden passage dissolved, replaced by stark, concrete surfaces. The space was narrow, confining, the ceiling low. Each door was made of thick, gray metal, scarred and dented, with a small, grimy viewport at eye level. This was no part of the manor I knew. This was a place of containment, of absolute isolation. My breath hitched. The words formed in my mind with an unnatural certainty, a memory that wasn't mine, yet felt utterly real. They pressed in from behind the bolted doors, from the cracks in the concrete, from the very air I breathed. They were no longer trying to confuse me, they were showing me. Force-feeding me. Images flashed, rapid fire, behind my eyes. Not visions I could control, but an onslaught. I saw figures, vague and indistinct, moving through ancient, forgotten rituals. I saw the manor, not as I knew it, but as a place of raw, unbridled power, a nexus. It wasn't built on a ley line, it was the ley line, a living conduit. And the entity. It wasn't just in the house. It was the house, in a way, or rather, the house was its anchor, its physical manifestation. It had always been here. Dormant, then stirring, then feeding. Not on fear. Not on blood, but on the very essence of what made a being distinct. Memory. Identity. It was a parasite, ancient beyond comprehension, that didn't kill its hosts but absorbed them. It didn't want a body, it wanted a mind, a life, a history. It wanted to be them, or rather, to add them to its ever-expanding, horrifying tapestry of stolen selves. I saw a woman, her face dissolving like old film, her memories flaking away, replaced by fragmented echoes of others. They didn't die, they simply ceased to be themselves. Their bodies walked, but their souls, their unique experiences, their very readiness, were gone, folded into the entity's monstrous being. It wasn't just taking memories, it was becoming the sum of all it consumed. A wave of nausea hit me, more potent than any physical blow. This wasn't some poltergeist. This was a cosmic horror in miniature, a devourer of the self, confined to these specific walls, yet reaching out through the generations. The isolation cells were not just a physical space, they were a representation of what happened to those who were fully consumed, trapped, isolated within their own minds, their identities stripped away, leaving only an empty vessel. The ultimate cost, then, was erasure. Complete, utter, spiritual annihilation. It was not appeasement the entity wanted. It wanted a sacrifice. A willing surrender. Not of a life, but of an identity. One complete, distinct self, offered freely, to complete its cycle, to fully anchor itself, to manifest in a way it hadn't been able to in centuries. It needed one final, profound act of self-sacrifice. Not to die, but to cease to be read, to become another thread in its awful, endless tapestry, thereby granting it some terrible, final power over the manor, over this realm. My own memories, already frayed, felt like they were being tugged, tested. It wasn't just showing me, it was offering me a choice. Give it what it wanted, and perhaps the horror would end. The manor would be quiet. But I would be gone. Reed would be gone. To become one of them, one of the lost, a whisper in its collective maw. To give up everything that made me, me. My love for antiques, my meticulous hands, my quiet life, my very name. It was a fate worse than death. Yet, the pressure was immense, the lure of an end to the torment almost unbearable. I stared at the heavy, bolted door closest to me, seeing my own reflection in the grimy viewport, a haggard, wild-eyed stranger. The sacrifice. I finally understood what it demanded. It was asking for my sacrifice. The whispers were a constant, a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, like a faulty electrical current in the ancient wiring of the manor. They no longer swirled in a chaotic, indecipherable din, not entirely. Now, they were sharper, coalescing into distinct, yet still maddeningly fragmented, voices. Sometimes they were my own, echoing forgotten decisions. Other times, they were strangers, lamenting losses I couldn't place, speaking of rooms I didn't recognize, of loves I'd never known. It was like living in a library where every book was open, all being read aloud simultaneously, just out of earshot. But the cold, hard defiance that had sparked in me remained. I clung to it like a life raft in a churning sea of borrowed memories. This thing, this presence, had played with me, yes, twisted my reality, but no more. I had been drawn to the deepest parts of the house, to the root cellars, the forgotten tunnels that snaked beneath the structure. It was a desperate instinct, a feeling that the answer lay not in what was visible, but in what was buried, what was meant to be forgotten. A hidden seam. With a pry bar I'd scavenged from a decaying toolshed, I worked at the mortar. Futility, one hissed, a breathy, dry sound.
Lost cause, another echoed, resonant and deep.
I ignored them, gritting my teeth, sweat stinging my eyes. Inside, tucked away in a niche, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was stiff, embossed with a faded, unrecognizable crest. The pages, brittle. With age, crackled as I opened it. The script was spidery, precise, written in an ink that had faded to sepia. It was a ledger of sorts, detailing the manor's architectural history, but not the kind I knew from official records. This was a personal account, a builder's desperate notes. And then I saw it. Something. This wasn't just a prison. Elias's notes spoke of layers of lead sheeting, of specific resonant frequencies meant to disrupt thought, to fragment memory. He believed that the house itself was alive, or rather, that something in the house was, and it fed. It fed on identity, on memory, on the very sense of self. A place to trap and starve the entity. The reveal hit me like a physical blow. This thing, this malevolent presence, wasn't just eroding my mind by chance. It was feeding. And the manor, in its ancient wisdom or desperate design, had already provided a weapon, a containment field. My mind, though still a fractured mosaic of half-truths and borrowed pasts, began to piece together a new picture, a terrifying, desperate plan. If the entity fed on memory and identity, then the only way to stop it was to deny it sustenance, to trap it in a place where such sustenance could not exist. And the only way to lure it there, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, was to offer it the ultimate meal. Myself. I would become the bait. I would concentrate my remaining identity, my most potent memories, my core essence, and offer it as a feast. But not to be consumed entirely. No. Once it was there, gorging on the essence I presented, I would seal it. Seal myself with it, if necessary. The sacrifice would be immense. It wouldn't just be a part of me, but potentially all of me. My very essence, my sanity, my unique spark. It was a gamble against an invisible enemy that had already infiltrated my mind, but it was the only gamble I had left. Foolish, they shrieked. Madness. I ignored them, my gaze fixed on Elias Thorne's journal, on the detailed diagrams of lead-lined walls and sound-dampening chambers. My hands, no longer trembling, began to move with a renewed, grim purpose. I had to prepare myself. Elias had left meticulous instructions, almost a ritual, for their activation and sealing. I needed to find the original mechanisms, or failing that, reconstruct them. This was no longer about restoring an antique house, it was about restoring myself, or at least, what little remained to fight. I began clearing the debris from the hidden passage Elias's journal had revealed. Each movement was deliberate, each breath a conscious effort. And I would be holding the key. Not a wine cellar, not a root cellar, but something far more deliberate, far more chilling. Lead-lined walls, sound-dampening chambers. My jaw was tight, a dull ache spreading across my temples. I moved with a grim, focused energy. No more hesitant steps, no more second-guessing. I followed Thorne's meticulous directions, descending deeper into the manor's foundations, past the familiar storage vaults and the old, disused cistern. It wasn't rust, it was something sharper, more sterile, yet undeniably ancient. The passage narrowed, the rough-hewn stone walls pressing in, until I reached a section where the mortar between the blocks was thick, almost oozing, and the stone itself felt denser, less porous. Here, Thorne's markings indicated a hidden mechanism. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of restoration, found the almost imperceptible seam, the faint ridge where a lever should be. With a grunt, I pulled. A grinding groan, like tectonic plates shifting, echoed through the confined space. The stench that wafted out was thick, cloying, a mix of damp earth, decay, and something else, something profoundly stagnant, like forgotten time. This was it. Each door was bolted, not with simple locks, but with multiple, industrial-grade latches, thick and rusted, suggesting not just security, but absolute containment. The phrase itself was a punch to the gut. The air here was utterly still, devoid of any natural draft, making my own breathing sound unnaturally loud, ragged. It felt incredibly dense. Places where nothing could enter, and nothing could escape. Perfect. I needed to isolate myself, to cut off the entity's tendrils of influence, to force the confrontation onto my own terms, however suicidal that might sound. Thorne had theorized that the lead in sound dampening might disrupt the entity's ability to anchor itself, to feed, to manipulate. It was a gamble, a desperate, final throw of the dice. Pushing it open, it moved with an unnatural ease, almost inviting. Inside, the cell was small, perhaps 8 by 8 feet, with walls of smooth, gray concrete, unblemished by time or graffiti. No windows, no ventilation grates. Just a single, rusted iron ring bolted to the floor in the center. The lantern light struggled to fill the space, swallowed by the profound emptiness. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an active pressure, a muffling of existence. I placed the lantern on the floor, its light a small, defiant beacon. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, I pulled the heavy door shut. The clang was dull, deadened, a final, definitive thud that sealed me in. For a moment, nothing. I stood there, rooted, waiting for the inevitable. It began subtly. A flicker at the edge of my vision, like a faulty bulb, but there was no bulb. The lantern's flame seemed to waver, though the wick was steady. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was too quiet. My own breathing, which had been so loud, now seemed to fade, as if my lungs were moving in a vacuum. It was my mother's voice, sweet and clear, telling me about the first antique I ever helped her restore, a tiny porcelain bird. "You have such a gentle touch, my boy," she murmured. But the memory warped, the bird's painted eyes suddenly black, vacant, its delicate wings snapping off in my clumsy, child's grip. Approving of a repair I'd made to an old clock. A true craftsman, read. But the laugh curdled, turning into a mocking snarl. The clock's gears seizing, grinding, then shattering into 1,000 useless pieces. My triumphs, my skills, my very identity as a restorer, began to unravel. The entity wasn't just showing me false memories, it was surgically altering the core ones, twisting the foundation of who I was. I saw myself as a boy, not carefully restoring, but carelessly breaking. My hands, which had given life back to countless forgotten objects, became instruments of destruction. My precision, my patience, my meticulous eye, all became sources of clumsy error, of botched jobs, of ruined artifacts. "I am Reed," I repeated, louder this time, trying to push through the suffocating pressure in my ears. "I restore. I fix." A memory flashed, me, standing over a shattered vase, its delicate patterns irretrievably lost, my face contorted in frustration, not pride. Another, a colleague, shaking his head sadly, pointing to a scratch I'd missed, a repair I'd botched. Their faces were indistinct, their roles generic, yet the judgment was searingly specific.
Was this true? Had I always been this incompetent, this careless? My name. What was my name? Reed.
It felt strange on my tongue, unfamiliar.
Was it my name?
Or had I simply adopted it, a placeholder for a self I'd never truly possessed? The entity wasn't just trying to erase my memories, it was trying to erase the very concept of me.
It was attacking the anchor points of my existence, severing them one by one. The walls of the cell seemed to ripple, the concrete breathing, expanding and contracting. My vision blurred, my head swam. Faces I knew, faces I loved, flickered into existence, their features melting, reforming into expressions of contempt, of disappointment. I opened my eyes, desperate for the stark reality of the cell, however terrifying. The iron ring in the floor, the rough texture of the concrete. These were real. I focused on them, on the tangible. My hands, calloused and stained, were real. My breath, still struggling, was real. I am Reed, I stated again, my voice stronger now, a desperate defiance against the mental assault. I am here. I am fighting you. The entity roared, not with sound, but with an internal pressure that threatened to burst my eardrums, to split my skull. A torrent of fragmented, contradictory memories flooded my mind, a life lived, then unlived, then lived differently. I was a child, then an old man. A restorer, then a demolisher. My own face, reflected in 1,000 shards, each one showing a different, alien me. But within that maelstrom, a single, stubborn thought persisted. The journal. Thorne's diagrams. The purpose of these cells. He had known. He had fought. And so would I. I was Reed. And I would fight for every fractured piece of myself. The pressure behind my eyes receded, slowly, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore. The torrent of lives unlived, of identities worn and discarded, still churned in the hollow spaces of my skull, a phantom echo of a scream that wasn't sound but sheer, unadulterated mental force. I lay on something hard, unyielding. My back ached. A dull thrum resonated in my ears, a low, persistent hum that vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. The air was cold, thin, carrying a faint, metallic tang. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, uncoordinated. My fingers, when I looked at them, seemed to belong to someone else, pale, with nails ragged and dirt ingrained beneath them. The room was a cube of bleached concrete, stark and unforgiving. A single, narrow slit of a window, high up, offered a sliver of muted light, revealing nothing but a featureless gray sky. The door was solid steel, devoid of handle or hinge on my side. No furniture, no personal effects. Just me, and the lingering taste of ash in my mouth. I was in a segregation unit isolation cell. My mind was a fractured mosaic. Images flickered, the manor, dust motes dancing in sunbeams, the smooth grain of an antique table beneath my careful hand. Then, conflicting flashes, a dense forest, an open sea, faces I couldn't quite place, yet felt a deep, unsettling familiarity with. Was I a restorer? The thought felt right, a fragile anchor in the storm of confusion, but the details, the specific tools, the scent of linseed oil and aged wood, they were gone, replaced by a dull ache. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the rough stubble of several days' growth. My cheekbones were sharper than I remembered, my jawline harder. Or was that just my perception? I didn't know what I remembered anymore. The entity. The manor. The consuming hunger. I had fought it, or had I? The memory of the confrontation was a blurred, violent tapestry of psychic force and desperate will. I recalled a kind of victory, a cessation of the direct assault, but the cost. My parents' names? Blank. My favorite book? A jumble of titles, none feeling quite right. The street I grew up on? A swirling fog. A small, grating sound outside the cell door made me flinch. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached, then stopped. A small, square panel slid open at eye level, revealing a pair of unblinking eyes, set in a face that was a mask of professional disinterest. Read, a voice, flat and uninflected, stated. It was a man's voice, rough-hewn. Are you awake? I stared, unable to form a coherent response. My name. He knew it. Did I? Your visitor will be here in an hour. A visitor. Who? A colleague? A detective? The very thought sent a tremor through me. What would I say? How would I explain the gaping holes in my own history, the phantom memories that still ghosted at the edges of my consciousness? My mind raced, not with solutions, but with a growing, suffocating panic. I was supposed to be a meticulous restorer, someone who understood the intricate dance of time and decay, who could piece together fragments into a coherent whole. Now, I was the fragment, and the whole was lost to me. The entity might be contained, its consuming hunger sated or dormant, but it had taken so much. It had not just stolen memories, it had dismantled the very architecture of myself, leaving behind a ruined foundation. I was a house with no rooms, a book with no words. And I didn't even know enough to mourn him properly. The hum of the building seemed to intensify, a low, guttural growl that resonated with the emptiness inside me. I was alone, trapped not just within these concrete walls, but within the confines of a mind that was no longer truly my own. The lingering scars weren't visible on my skin, but etched into the very core of my being, a permanent testament to the insidious, identity-eroding horror I had faced. The panel slid shut with a metallic clang that echoed in the small space, leaving me once again in the oppressive silence, save for the dull thrum of the ventilation system. An hour. A visitor. My name. The word spun, detached and meaningless. What was my name? Read. It tasted unfamiliar, like sand on my tongue. I ran a hand over my jaw, feeling the stubble, the unfamiliar contours of a face I thought I knew. The weight was a peculiar kind of torment. Not the terror of the manor, not the gnawing void of forgotten time, but a sterile, controlled agony. Every minute felt stretched, an elastic band pulled taut, threatening to snap. My mind drifted, trying to grasp at threads of memory, but they were slick, elusive. The manor, its dust, its secrets, the scent of decaying wood and damp earth, those images were vivid, almost painfully real. But the moments before it, the life of Reed the meticulous antique restorer, seemed distant, a story told about someone else. When the heavy door finally slid open, I flinched, the sudden light searing my eyes. A tall figure stood framed in the opening, a legal representative, I assumed, though I couldn't recall his name or why he was here. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his face unreadable, holding a folder. He didn't look at me directly, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder.
"Read," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection.
"You're being released."
Released? The word was a heavy stone, dropped into a still pond.
No ripple. No joy. Just a dull thud.
I was led through a series of stark, fluorescent-lit corridors, the smell of disinfectant clinging to the air, past other identical doors of other segregation unit isolation cells.
My legs felt unsteady, unaccustomed to the longer strides, to the sheer space of the hallway.
The world outside the cell felt too bright, too loud, too real. A car ride followed, the landscape a blur of green and gray.
He spoke of arrangements, of a temporary residence far from the manor, of legalities.
I nodded, mumbled agreement, the words passing through me without true comprehension.
I was free. I had survived.
The entity, the manor, the crumbling walls of my mind, I had escaped.
That was the victory, wasn't it?
My new place was an apartment in a city I didn't recognize, hundreds of miles from the manor. It was clean, modern, sterile. It was a blank, expectant quiet, as if waiting for something to fill it. I bought new clothes, tried to eat regular meals, even attempted to read.
But the words on the page swam, refusing to coalesce into meaning.
My hands, once so steady, so precise with delicate antiques, trembled slightly. The scent of old wood, of dust, of faint iron, it lingered in my nostrils, a phantom odor that no amount of clean air could dispel.
One evening, I sat by the window, watching the city lights blink on. A faint hunger stirred within me, not for food, but for something less tangible.
I closed my eyes, picturing the intricate patterns of a forgotten tapestry, the smooth grain of a polished mahogany table, the chipped glaze of an ancient ceramic. I could almost feel them, the weight of their history, the echoes of the hands that had touched them, the minds that had shaped them.
Then, I focused on a memory.
Not one of my own, but a vague, indistinct image of the legal representative's face, etched into my mind from our brief interaction. And as I did, a strange sensation bloomed in my chest, a flicker, a warmth, like a tiny spark igniting. A few days later, I found myself in a small,
independent bookstore.
The smell of paper and ink was a comfort, a familiar anchor. I picked up an old, leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. My fingers traced the faded gilt, the worn spine. As I held it, a sudden, vivid image flashed in my mind, a young woman, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, hunched over a desk, meticulously inscribing the book's first owner's name. I felt the slight ache in her hand, the warmth of the lamp on her cheek, the quiet pride in her craft.
It wasn't my memory.
It was hers. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs.
I stumbled back, knocking into a display.
The store owner, a young woman with kind eyes, hurried over.
"Are you all right, sir?"
She reached out to steady me, her hand brushing my arm.
In that instant, it happened again.
A rush of sensation, a fleeting, bittersweet pang of nostalgia for a childhood pet, a sense of longing for a simpler time.
It was her memory. Her feeling.
It flowed into me, a tiny, exquisite drop of another's lived experience. I pulled away sharply, staring at my own hand.
It wasn't trembling now. It felt hungry.
A terrible realization bloomed in the sterile quiet of my apartment later that night, as I sat alone, the city lights mocking me with their distant indifference. The manor had been a cage, a trap, but it had also been a crucible. The entity hadn't simply fed on my memories, it had reshaped me.
It had taught me.
My eyes, once a familiar shade of gray, seemed to hold a deeper, older light, a knowing glint I didn't recognize. The victory I had celebrated, the escape I thought I'd achieved, was nothing but a cruel, final twist.
The entity wasn't gone. It hadn't left me. It had integrated.
It had become a part of me, a new, unsettling hunger that now resided in my core. I was a vessel, a new kind of collector, capable of drawing forth not just the history of objects, but the very essence of the lives that had touched them. And the taste of it, the faint, sweet aftertaste, was growing more potent, more addictive, with every fleeting, stolen memory.
It felt like an invitation.
And I was, for the first time in a long time, truly, terrifyingly, ready.